Wizard101 is a game that, for all intents and purposes, is made for children. It is marketed towards children and being family friendly at the end of the day. Despite the game diving into some pretty dark subject matters such as mass extinction, slavery, the death of a significant other, mass discrimination, death, war, and more death. Now, Wizard101 was released all the way back in 2008, and while the game has been consistently receiving updates the entire time, one thing that this game suffers from is that over the years it has become incredibly easy, to the point where the entire first arc of the game was able to be beaten while being level locked and being extremely handicapped. By the way, I highly recommend watching Xerath's Nuzlocke video if you haven't. This was an incredible feat to accomplish either way. With that being said, a lot of veteran players, especially those who don't really involve themselves in the PvP community, spend time figuring out ways to challenge themselves in the PvE side of things. A Wiz YouTuber by the name of Alexander Lionheart is a prime example. Alexander Lionheart's strength lies in his ability to solo some of the hardest bosses and dungeons in this entire game. A lot of these being dungeons and bosses that are a struggle to deal with even with a full team, which makes soloing them all the more impressive. One of these dungeons in particular is going to be the focus of this video. Darkmoor. Darkmoor is Wizard101's most popular and iconic dungeon in the game. It was released all the way back in 2014, and you unlock it once you reach level 100. Now, the reason why Darkmoor is so iconic is because it is a huge spike in power and difficulty. Once you're able to obtain the gear from this place, you become exponentially more powerful. And so when this dungeon first came out, it was the place to be. In Darkmoor's earlier days, so many people would be absolutely lined up outside of this dungeon in order to find team. Darkmoor truly was the hottest area in the game in between like 2014 to 2016. Like I said, not only because of the gear drops, but because of how difficult this dungeon is. Darkmoor to this day can still be a nightmare if your team isn't coordinated or if you don't understand the boss cheats and mechanics properly. The amount of runs that have been lost simply because multiple people in the team just didn't understand how the boss worked is probably a very scary high number. So you can imagine how hard soloing this dungeon would be. But that's where the challenge comes in. Can Darkmoor be soloed, and more so, can Darkmoor be soloed at the exact level you unlock it at, which is level 100? In order to understand the true scale of how difficult Darkmoor really is, we're gonna break down the dungeon and see just how much it would take to solo it. Alright, so for those of you watching the video who have never played Wizard101 at all, maybe you only saw the game through the commercials and are just curious as to how the game even works in the first place, I will quickly go over the basic mechanics of Wizard101 so you're not confused and you can follow along the video as well. Wizard101 is your typical turn-based card game where you are only allowed to cast one spell per round. Your overall health is at the bottom left, while the enemy's health is listed under the enemy's name. Whoever's health drops to 0 first is the loser, of course. A big thing I need to mention is that the system that determines who goes first or second in any battle in this game, outside of a few exceptions that I'll explain later, is complete RNG. It is a complete 50-50 chance whether or not you go first in this game, which is kind of what makes this game frustrating a lot of the time. And as I'll go more into later, going second in this game, especially doing hard boss fights, is the worst experience of your life. Those little balls in front of your wizard and your opponent are called pips. Pips are what's used to cast your spells, and you can only cast certain spells if you have enough pips. The little number right under the name of the spell is how many pips that spell requires. The stronger the spell, the more pips you will require to use. The gold pips are called power pips, which simply means these are worth 2 instead of just 1. However, power pips only apply to the school that you are assigned to. So for example, if I have 2 power pips, I'm allowed to use a 4-pip spell from the school that I am. But if I wanted to use a spell from another school that costs 4 pips while having 2 power pips, I won't be able to. There are damage spells, which obviously do damage to the enemy, healing spells, which will allow you to heal yourself, blades are spells you can put on yourself or your teammate in order to boost the damage of an upcoming damage spell from you or your teammate. So if I cast a Stormblade on myself, for example, then cast a damage spell, I'll do 30% more damage. There are also traps, which pretty much have the same function as blades, but they have to be placed on the enemy and not yourself. Majority of the time in this game, blades are the preferred option simply because once you get past the first world, every single fight has you usually going up against multiple enemies. So if you blade yourself and do an AoE attack, you will do increased damage on all enemies. However, if you place a trap on only one enemy, then use that same AoE attack, the damage will only be increased on that one enemy you place the trap on. However, as we'll see later on in this video, traps are going to be a very important part of this challenge. A particular trap I need to mention is Feint, the most important trap in this game period. Feint is arguably the most important spell in the game. Feint is a trap that increases the damage you do by 70%, with the only downside being that a 30% trap gets placed on yourself. Feint is one of those spells that no matter what school you are in this game, you must train into because it is just that good. Every single person who plays this game will have to train Feint at some point. There are shields in this game as well, which as the name suggests will reduce the damage you take from an attack spell from an enemy. There are negative charms, which when placed on the enemy will negatively affect a potential future spell they use. For example, weakness, which will reduce the damage of an incoming attack stack by 25%, and dispels, which will force the enemy to fizzle the spell of the corresponding school. There are bubble or global spells, which are kind of like field spells from Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically. They increase the damage of every single spell from that school regardless of who plays it. So if I cast a storm bubble, every single storm hit I do or the enemy does will do 25% more damage. And this effect will go on unless somebody changes the bubble, obviously. There are spells also known as enchants, where you can equip them to other spells in order to make them stronger. Examples include Colossal and Epic, which when equipped to a damage spell increases its base damage by 275 or 300. However, you can only equip one enchant per damage spell. You can't just stack 4 onto one, thankfully. There are a couple other enchants that are going to be very important for this video that I need to mention: Potent Trap and Sharpened Blade especially. Sharpened Blade increases the strength of your blade by 10%, and Potent Trap does the same thing but for traps. Meaning that if I equip a Sharpened Blade with a normal Storm Blade, instead of increasing the damage of my next hit by 35%, it'll increase it by 45 instead. The reason why these are arguably the second and third most important spells in the game is that these allow you to blade and trap stack. So let's say you pack 2 Storm Blades in your deck and a Sharpened Blade. If you sharpen one of them and use both on yourself, these will stack together and boost your damage by a combined 80%. But it doesn't stop there, because if you have a treasure card Storm Blade, that's another 35%. Have a TC version of Sharpen, that's another 45%. In Wizard101, you can stack as many different blades as possible as long as they aren't the same exact one, or if they weren't enchanted by the same exact Sharpened Blade. So for example, you can't just use 2 normal Sharpened Blades that go in your normal deck because they won't stack. Meaning that 2 Sharpened Storm Blades won't stack if both Sharpened Blades came from your normal deck. However, a Sharpened Storm Blade and using a TC Sharpen on a normal Storm Blade will stack. The same rule obviously applies to traps as well. So for example, a normal feint and a TC feint will stack. When done correctly, will put out an additional 140% more damage. Add a potent feint to that, that's 210%. Add a normal feint that's equipped with a TC version of Potent Trap, that's plus 280% damage. Add a feint item card that you get from an amulet or a pet, that's plus 350% damage, and so on and so forth. The last thing I'm going to mention are utility spells and spells that have effects. Utility spells are exactly as they sound: spells that don't heal, do damage, or enhance damage but are still very helpful. The only ones you need to know for this video today are Empower, Reshuffle, and Prisms. Empower's effect is very simple. You pay 250 health in order to get 3 pips. The main use for it a lot of times isn't always just for the 3 pips, but in a scenario where an enemy places a weakness on you, you can use the Empower spell, which will not only get rid of the weakness, but you also go plus 2 in pips. Reshuffle, which as the name suggests, simply reshuffles all the cards you've used or discarded back into your deck. And Prisms, which will take whatever damage spell you do and convert it to the opposite school. So if you use a Fire Prism on the enemy, then attack with a Fire spell, it will be converted to do ice damage instead. This is the most useful, obviously, when fighting bosses that are the same school of magic as you, since bosses in this game have an ungodly amount of resist towards the school that they are. So now that we explained the basic mechanics of the game, let's get into why Darkmoor is an absolute nightmare to not only solo, but even with the full team, it's problematic. Now, Darkmoor is split into 3 parts: the Observatory, the Upper Halls, and the Graveyard. You need to do these 3 parts consecutively in this order in order to complete the entirety of Darkmoor. There are 8 boss fights in total, and each one has their own cheats and mechanics that you need to know, otherwise you will not be able to beat them. For this part of the video, I want to go through the bosses one by one and explain their cheats and mechanics. We're going to use Alexander Lionheart's Darkmoor solo as an example for this part of the video. He's running with the Ice School and he's doing it at level 140. Starting with Darkmoor Part 1, the first boss you encounter is Howling Cheney, a life boss with 20,000 HP. Luckily, Howling Cheney is the easiest of the 8 Darkmoor bosses by far. His cheat is pretty trash, and you usually won't even trigger it unless you somehow end up in a really bad situation. Because his cheat is simply that if a wizard casts a healing spell, Howling Cheney will cheat cast gnomes on the wizard who healed. He has a life interrupt cycle where on the second round and every round after that, he will interrupt cast a 12% life spear on himself. At the beginning of the third round and every 3 rounds after this, he will interrupt cast a life fuel on a random wizard, and that's about it. Howling Cheney is pretty much a breeze to deal with. Even with his 3 mobs that are relatively tanky, they don't do that much damage. The only thing that's slightly concerning about him is that he does have 25% pierce. Keep this outgoing pierce stat in mind, because as you go through the rest of Darkmoor, this starts to matter a whole lot more. The best way to go about this fight is to simply just blade up and hit for the most part. You can even feint in this fight as well, which makes this all the more easier on top of that. Alexander's strat was simply to just blade and hit. There's nothing too special about this one, so let's get into boss number 2. Boss number 2 is Sir Blackwater, a Star School boss with 18,000 HP, and this is where things start to get rough, because this is where the cheats actually start to matter. Even a full team will struggle with these if they're not careful. Cheat number 1. If a wizard casts a blade or a bubble spell, Sir Blackwater will interrupt cast Disarm on the wizard who used it. Cheat number 2. If a wizard plays any type of weakness spell on Sir Blackwater, he will interrupt cast a Dark Pact on himself to get rid of it. And then what Dark Pact itself does is that it will replace the weakness you tried to put on him with a 30% blade instead. Cheat number 3 are his interrupt cycles, which happen every 5 rounds. He has a death interrupt cycle, a life interrupt cycle, and a storm one. On his death interrupt cycle at the end of every round, he will interrupt cast Sacrifice on himself, which is annoying because if you have any universal traps on him like Feint, well, you can kiss that goodbye. At the beginning of the 5th round during this cycle, he will interrupt cast Age of Reckoning, Virulence, a Death Blade, and then slam you with a Call of Cthulhu. During his life interrupt cycle, at the end of each round, he'll interrupt cast a Spirit Armor on himself. And at the beginning of the 5th round during this cycle, he will interrupt cast Sanctuary, Cycle of Life, a Guiding Light, and Rebirth, which will heal the entire enemy team. Now, if you're soloing, this cycle isn't as bad as the other one, since you'd rather deal with the heal than getting destroyed by a buff Call of Cthulhu, but it can still be a pain, especially if that Spirit Armor is the difference between you killing the boss or not killing when you attack. And finally, his Storm interrupt cycle. At the end of every round during this cycle, he will interrupt cast Healing Current. Then at the beginning of the 5th round during this cycle, he will interrupt cast Astrophobia, Galvanic Field, Storm Blade, and then smokes you with a Glowbug Squall. Now, granted, this is post-nerf Glowbug Squall, which makes things slightly better because pre-nerf Glowbugs would not only deal insane damage, but remove all the blades you have on yourself. To make this fight even more annoying is that he has 3 minions that are all randomized. You can either get the Darkmoor Surf minions, the Darkmoor Squires, or a mixture of the two. From my experience, the more preferred one is the Darkmoor Surfs, because even though they're storm mobs that do more damage and can even potentially stun you if they storm lure, the Darkmoor Squire is infinitely more annoying because the chances of them using a Virulent Plague, which when placed reduces the damage of the next spell you do by 40%, is a lot higher than the chances of the Darkmoor Surf using Stormlord. And it's infuriating having to waste a turn to get rid of it with an Empower, for example, because that's an extra turn you could have used to potentially either blade yourself, trap, set up a hit, or just straight up go for game. And if that Virulent Plague throws your timing completely off and that next turn just so happens to be Sir Blackwater's interrupt cycle, you're immediately put in a horrible spot and the run is probably dead. So with that out of the way, let's analyze how Alexander Lionheart did it. So the battle begins, and of course Alexander Lionheart pulls first. He also pulls 3 Darkmoor Squire mobs, which is honestly the hardest way to go, but because he's doing this at level 140, the mob pool doesn't matter nearly as much. Also, he has over 10k HP and a lot more damage you can muster at level 100, meaning that there's much more breathing room in this fight, period. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that his entire deck, including treasure cards, only consists of 14 cards. This is a standard strategy that most experienced Wiz players use, where you purposely keep your deck incredibly small so that every single turn you have the exact card you need ready to go when you need it. The max amount of cards that a player can have in a deck is 64, I'm pretty sure, and if you include the TC deck, you can obviously have over 100. But 99% of the time, this is the most unoptimal way to play unless you're doing like PvP or something. See, there's this dumb feature in the game that I'll mention where when you learn a new spell, for some reason, the game automatically places it in your deck. So a lot of beginners just assume that's the best way to go. And when it comes to a lot of bad players, their decks will look something like this. Yeah, don't do this. Anyway, so his starting hand consists of Ice Trap, Potent Trap, Sharpened Blade, 3 Elementals, and his main damage win condition, that being Snowball Barrage, a powerful AoE spell that you unlock at level 108. Alexander Lionheart spends the first 3 rounds of the match stacking Elemental Blades, since if he uses normal Ice Blades, Sir Blackwater's cheat will just get rid of it. However, using Elemental Blades will sort of bypass this because Sir Blackwater will only steal the last blade placed from these 3 blades, meaning that the Ice Blade will be safe. He places an Ice Trap on round 4, then just tanks the Cthulhu cheat on round 5. He then stacks Ice Trap on the boss and finally uses Snowball Barrage to go for game, doing 36,000 damage, which is double his HP. And with that, he is on to the next part of Darkmoor. Starting Darkmoor Part 2, we get to boss number 3, Octane Wormcrawl. This boss is really simple, so I won't spend too much time on him. He has the same main cheat as Sir Blackwater, where if you cast a blade on yourself, he'll use Steel Charm on you. So once again, easiest workaround is just to use Elemental Blade. He's accompanied by 3 Storm mobs, which are pretty similar to the Darkmoor Serps I mentioned earlier, with a few small differences in card pool. Either way though, as long as they don't play Stormlord, they really aren't that hard to deal with either. Only alarming thing about Octane Wormcrawl is that he does have 40% Pierce, which is kind of ridiculous. Alexander Lionheart's strategy is very simple, just blade and trap stacking while tanking the hits and going for game with Snowball Barrage, and with that, we're on to boss number 4 of 8. Spirit of Darkmoor is the 4th boss, and we're now at the halfway point of Darkmoor. Her cheats are as follows. If a wizard casts a blade or a global spell, she would cheat cast an enhanced version of Scald, which deals 999 fire damage over 3 rounds to all wizards. Now, the reason why this is annoying is because, like the previous boss, Spirit of Darkmoor has 40% Pierce, meaning that unless you're at least rocking significantly over 50 resist, no matter what, that damage overtime she puts on you will be problematic, especially if you plan on blade stacking, because then that's multiple damage overtimes on you. Cheat number 2. If a wizard places a trap on the Spirit of Darkmoor, she will cheat cast a version of Assail, which will deal 850 myth damage and places 2 myth traps on the wizard. However, AoE trap spells such as Windstorm won't trigger this cheat. Cheat number 3. If a wizard defeats a minion, she will cheat cast a sun version of Eternal Leviathan, which deals 777 life damage to the wizard who dealt the killing blow, and then will instantly revive the defeated minion or minions. Cheat number 4 is the same as Sir Blackwater in that she also has her interrupt cycles. Her myth interrupt cycle is first, where at the beginning of the 5th round, she will cast a myth spear on herself, which gives her even more pierce, a myth blade, Saga of Heroes, and then slam you with a Mystic Colossus. After this will mark the beginning of her life interrupt cycle, which at the beginning of the 5th round during the cycle, which will be the 10th round of the overall duel, she will cast a life spear, life blade, namaste, and then a hungry caterpillar on the highest threat wizard, and because we're in a solo setting, you're the one getting hit. And finally, her fire interrupt cycle, where at the beginning of the 5th round or the 15th round of the duel, she will cast a 12% fire spear, Fire Blade, and then hit you with a fire from above. So what's the strategy for beating her? Well, one thing I forgot to mention is that Spirit of Darkmoor only has 14,700 HP, which is almost 4,000 less than Sir Blackwater, who had 18,000. Because she has a cheat that revives her minions, the best strategy is to either A, defeat her first and save the minions for later, or B, defeat them all at once. You also have to be very careful of the minions who are all myth and have the chance to cast Medusa or Basilisk, which will stun you. Medusa worse because it stuns you for 2 turns. If you get hit with one of these, you will be put in a horrible position. Let's see what Alexander Lionheart does in his run. Now, once again, he is running with a small deck size, which is pivotal for him. His starting hand consists of 2 Ice Blades, Snowball Barrage, an Epic Enchant, Feint, and Frenzy. Frenzy is actually really clever because since it's an aura, it won't trigger the Spirit of Darkmoor cheat while also giving you an extra 40% damage, which is pretty much the equivalent of an Ice Blade. I should also mention that Alexander Lionheart did this run before the different school blades all got nerfed and set to 35% for everybody across the board, which is why you see 40% Ice Blade and then 50% Ice Blade with the Sharpened Blade equipped. He spends his first 2 rounds blade stacking, then round 3 he goes for a potent feint, and he uses Frenzy on turn 4. Because like I said, he's rocking a good amount of health, he's able to tank the Myth Interrupt cycle and go for game on turn 5, and luckily the minions weren't that much of a problem either. With that, Spirit of Darkmoor is defeated, and we are now on to boss number 5 and the final boss of Darkmoor Part 2. Boss number 5 is Shane Von Shane. Let's go through his cheats. If a feint is cast on Shane Von Shane, he will interrupt cast a Dark Pact on himself, getting rid of the feint. However, Mass Feint will not trigger this cheat. If a harmful charm is cast on Shane Von Shane, he will interrupt cast Sacrifice on himself. However, AoE harmful effects such as Plague won't trigger this cheat. If a wizard casts a healing spell, then Shane will interrupt cast a version of Vampire, dealing 1050 death drain damage. Pet May cast will trigger this cheat. And just like Sir Blackwater and Spirit of Darkmoor, he does have an interrupt cycle. His works a little bit differently though. His interrupt cycle is kind of like Belloc's cheat, but a little bit worse. His interrupt cycle only triggers if you fail to damage him every turn. So if you fail to damage him for 1 turn, he will interrupt cast a version of Vampire, dealing 1000 drain damage. If you don't damage him for 2 turns, he'll interrupt cast Dr. Von's Monster, dealing 900 drain damage. And if you don't damage him for 3 turns, he will interrupt cast a version of Monster Mash, dealing 1170 death damage, and beguiles a random wizard. Beguile essentially just means you are now on the enemy side for a turn. The minions he has are also RNG as well, where it can either be the Darkmoor Serfs, the Darkmoor Gargoyles, or a mixture of the 2. In Alexander Lionheart's run, he opts to just triple blade off the start and take the interrupt cheats to the face. On turn 4, he goes for his wand attack in order to reset the Shane interrupt cycle, but something interesting happens here. Because he's using the Sky Captain's boarding hook, after using this wand attack, he actually triggers his weapon May cast, summoning a minion to fight alongside him. Now, some would argue that this is sort of a cheese strat, but considering it's a complete RNG, then the May cast will even trigger, and after watching the rest of the fight, he would have won without the minion anyway. I will completely let it slide. This does not take anything away from this run. Anyways, the turn after this, he uses Frenzy and then goes for game. You're gonna start noticing a trend here that the bosses in Darkmoor are starting to get a little bit silly. But like I said, because Alexander Lionheart is doing this at level 140, there's a lot of room for flexibility. Since he has a good amount of HP, dealing with the interrupt cast from the bosses isn't the worst thing in the world. Also, he has more damage than a level 100 can pull off, meaning that he can kill much faster with way less setup. Which begs the question, how on earth would a person be able to pull this off 40 levels lower than what Alexander Lionheart is doing it at? Don't worry, we will get there. But with that being said, this is the end of Darkmoor Part 2, and we are now on to Darkmoor Part 3, the Graveyard. The Graveyard is the most challenging of the 3 Darkmoor parts, and when Darkmoor first came out, full teams used to absolutely struggle with this place. The Graveyard is very unforgiving, and in a solo setting, the amount of RNG it takes to beat this is unbelievable. Let's go over the bosses. Boss number 1 and the 6th boss of Darkmoor is Yevgenny Night Creeper, a Moon School boss with 22,400 HP, who also happens to have Ice, Myth, and Death Mastery. He has 60% incoming Ice Resist and 30% Death and Myth Resist. Oh, and if you were wondering, this is his card pool. He can choose to slam any of these into you whenever he feels like it. Oh, and if that weren't enough, he just so happens to have 55% armor pierce. Honestly, just those things alone would make this boss tough to beat, but of course, he also has a slew of unbearable cheats. Let's go through them. Cheat number 1. If a wizard casts a blade spell, Yevgenny would cheat cast Freeze on the wizard. Basically, you get insta-stunned if you blade. Cheat number 2. If a wizard casts a shield, he would cheat cast Pierce on the wizard that received it. Oh, real quickly, I need to mention, even the minions in this fight have cheats, as they will also cheat cast Steel Ward to remove any remaining shields on the wizard at the end of a turn. Cheat number 3. If a wizard casts a negative charm, he would cheat cast Bad Juju on the wizard. And of course, he also has everyone's favorite, the infamous interrupt cycle. We're pretty much used to it at this point. Rounds number 1 through 5 is his ice interrupt cycle. At the beginning of every round in this cycle, Yevgenny will cast a frozen armor on himself or one of his minions. And it doesn't use his pips either, so if he just decides not to hit that much during this cycle and save his pips up, he'll just have a bunch of beefy frozen armor shields either on himself or his minions. Because frozen armor will shield you for 185 incoming damage times the amount of pips you have. So at 10 pips, that's 1,185 damage you're safe from. Then, similar to Spirit of Darkmoor, at the beginning of the 5th round, he will cast Catabat Katabatic Wind, Mass Ice Trap, an Ice Blade, and then slam you with an Abominable Weaver. What makes this even worse is that a lot of times the minions will blade Yevgenny before this happens, meaning that he's also blade stacked a little bit when he does this. Also, because of Katabatic Wind, whatever remaining resist you had is completely gone, meaning that if you walk into this fight with 75% resist, mind you, that much resist in of itself is pretty hard to obtain. That resist is essentially 0. After this, round 6 to 10 is his myth interrupt cycle, which at the beginning of every round he will cast a buff minion on himself or one of his minions, which is basically just a 50% blade. Then at the beginning of the 5th round during this cycle, which is of course the 10th round of the duel, he will cast Saga of Heroes, Mass Myth Trap, Mythblade, and then hits you with a Mystic Colossus. Rounds 11 through 15 is the death interrupt cycle, where at the beginning of every round, Yevgenny will cast a 75% feint on a random wizard, which if you're soloing, that random wizard is you. At the beginning of the 5th round during the cycle, or the 15th round of the duel, he will cast Doom and Gloom, a Death Blade, Mass Death Trap, and Call of Cthulhu. This one is surprisingly the most tame of the 3, because 99% of the time the fight won't drag on this long. If the fight has gone on this long, you're doing something wrong. But also the reason why it's the most tame is because the bubble he puts up is Doom and Gloom instead of Age of Reckoning. That's really weird. Oh, and by the way, we're still not done, because he has a secondary interrupt cycle. On round 3 of the duel, which would be during the ice interrupt cycle, Yevgenny will cast a version of Shift Chaining, dealing 800 life damage. On round 6 during the myth interrupt cycle, he will cast a version of Shift Octane, dealing 1000 fire damage. And on round 9, he will cast a moon version of Shift Blackwater, dealing 1200 moon damage. Yeah, Yevgenny does not fuck around, and this is only the first boss of the graveyard. On top of that, his minions can be a big problem too. Now, for some reason, and I don't know if this is a coding problem or not, but for some reason, these minions have 2 versions of Frostbite, and 80% of the time, that's the only spell they use. The other 20%, they will either Ice Blade, will Legion Shield, maybe Tower Shield, and that's it. Usually. There is still a chance they can Frost Giant, and if they just so happen to use it after Conviction is gone, that's a wasted turn and the run is probably over. So, with all that explained, let's analyze how Alexander Lionheart goes through it. He starts the fight off by using Conviction, which is the best way to deal with his stun sheet. This allows him to start blade stacking comfortably without getting stunned. The next 3 turns he blade stacks, and on turn 5 he tanks the cheat and casts Mass Ice Prism. On turn 6 he uses Potent Feint. He then is also able to tank the Shift Octane cheat. Turn 7 he goes for the Pierce to get rid of the Tower Shield. Turn 8, he goes for the Sleet Storm aura, which gives him 25% more damage. Opting for Sleet Storm instead of Frenzy here is actually super clever, since if he used Frenzy, he would also take 30% more damage from the enemy for the next 4 turns, which is not what you want here. And on turn 9, he goes for game with Snowball Barrage. Now, while he was successful, one thing you'll notice is that he ended the fight with only 482 HP left. Mind you, he started the fight with 10k. It took that much HP to finish this fight. Keep that in mind for later. We are now on to the penultimate boss of Darkmoor, Shane Von Shane 2. He is now a Star School boss with 21,200 HP. This time around, he also has Storm spells in his card pool as well. He's rocking 50% Storm and Death Resist, and of course, 55% Outgoing Pierce. Let's go over his cheats. Cheat number 1. If a wizard casts a positive charm, Shane will cast a 0-pip supercharge on himself. The way supercharge works still applies, similar to Yevgeny's frozen armor cheat, meaning that if he has 8 pips when his cheat happens, he will get a 96% supercharge. Cheat number 2. If a wizard places a negative charm on Shane, he will use sacrifice on himself. Cheat 3. If you cast Feint on Shane, he will Dark Pact himself. However, Mass Feint will bypass this. Cheat number 4. If a wizard casts a healing spell, he will cast an enhanced version of Vampire, dealing 1000 damage. Cheat 5. If you damage Shane, he will cheat cast a version of Healing Current that will heal him for 100, 400, or 1000 health. And of course, the dreaded interrupt cycles again. He has a Storm interrupt cycle and a Death interrupt cycle now. The Storm cycle starts at the end of round 1 and repeats every 4 rounds. His Storm interrupt cycle is as follows. At the end of the first round of the cycle, Shane Von Shane will cast Stormblade on himself. At the end of the second round, he'll cast Storm Spear. At the end of the third round, he will cast Galvanic, and on the fourth, he will use a natural attack on you. Luckily, this natural attack actually doesn't do too much damage, all things considered, so this one is actually the less scarier one. His Death interrupt cycle is the exact same as the one in the Shane Von Shane 1 fight. If you're able to damage him every round, you can actually avoid this cheat. Also, similar to Shane Von Shane 1, the minions he's accompanied with can only either be the Darkmoor Gargoyles, the Darkmoor Serfs, or a mixture of the two. All things considered, it is safe to say that Shane Von Shane 2 is surprisingly the easiest fight at Graveyard, so let's see how Alex did it. He starts off by using an Iceberg treasure card, which is really smart, since not only does it do damage, but it also gives you a 40% Ice Blade as well, setting him up with a blade, but also making sure the interrupt cycle does not trigger. His pet also has Maycast Brace, which is really helpful. On turn 2, he goes for an Ice Blade to stack. He then unfortunately gets stunned, which means he's forced to tank 2 turns of the interrupt cycle. On turn 4, he goes for a wand hit to reset the interrupt cycle. On turn 5 and 6, he stacks 2 more Ice Blades. Turn 7, he goes for another wand hit. Turn 8, he stacks 1 more Ice Blade. And on turn 9, he goes for Snowball Barrage. We are now at the final boss of Darkmoor, Malistaire the Undying. Not gonna waste any time, let's get into his cheats. At the beginning of the first round, Malistaire would cheat cast a Shadow Megaton on the first wizard. This cheat is actually what causes him to respawn with 100 health upon his defeat, and will cause him to spawn as Haunted Malistaire afterwards. Cheat number 2. If a wizard casts a universal damage blade such as Balance Blade, or a universal positive damage ward such as Tower Shield, he will cast Steel Charm or Steel Ward on the wizard that received the effect. Pet spells will trigger this cheat. However, if a multi-target blade or ward spell such as Blade Storm or Legion Shield is used, only the caster will be affected. Secondary spell effects such as the shield that you get from Abominable Weaver will not trigger this cheat. Cheat number 3. If a universal trap is placed on Malistaire, he will cast a cleanse word on himself, getting rid of it. However, AoE enemy charms such as Mass Feint will not trigger this cheat. And if a universal negative charm is placed on Malistaire such as Black Mantle, he will cast cleanse charm on himself to get rid of it. However, negative charms that affect all enemies will not trigger this cheat. Cheat number 4. If Elemental Defuse or Spirit Defuse is used, Malistaire will use a version of cleanse charm to remove all 3 dispels. Cheat number 5. If any weakness is placed on Malistaire, he will cast an Empower to get rid of it. Weakness-based pet spells and secondary spell effects such as Ifrit will trigger this cheat. Cheat number 6. If a wizard uses a single target damage spell against Malistaire, he will cast Black Mantle on the wizard after the attack. And now for, of course, the dreaded interrupt cycles. So Malistaire's first form revolves around 2 cheat cycles, a primary interrupt cycle and a secondary interrupt cycle. Both will overlap with each other throughout the battle. The primary cycle repeats every 5 rounds. At the end of the 3rd round in this cycle, Malistaire will polymorph into a black dragon and attack a random wizard, dealing 535 moon damage and destroying any aura effects. At the end of the 4th round, he will cast a sun version of Deadly Minotaur on a random wizard. And at the end of the 5th round, he will cast an aura that grants him 50% outgoing death damage and 20% more power pip chance for 5 rounds. Now for a second interrupt cycle. The secondary interrupt cycle activates after the beginning of the 5th round and repeats itself every 4 rounds. At the beginning of the 5th round, Malistaire's Skeletal Dragon will remove all charms and wards from each wizard, and this will happen every 4 rounds after this. Once you kill Malistaire the first time, he will revive himself in his second shadow form. Once he comes back, he interrupt casts a shadow spell that sets his max health to 48,000. However, he will lose all of his shadow pips permanently after this. You can nullify this by using Doom and Gloom just before he revives, so that he only revives to 25,000 HP instead of his 48,000. That's usually the strat people do whenever they're speedrunning this dungeon. But note that it has to be the treasure card version, not the normal version that goes in your normal deck. Now, Shadow Malistaire retains all the cheats that I mentioned before with a few exceptions. He now has to add a part of his secondary interrupt cycle where Malistaire's Skeletal Dragon will at random place a 100% universal trap on Malistaire himself. The primary interrupt cycle is replaced with a shadow version, while still cycling every 4 turns. So at the end of the 1st round, he will cast Shadow Blade on himself. At the end of the 2nd round, he will cast Shadow Spear. Then at the end of the 3rd, he will cast Shadow Trap. And at the end of the 4th round, he will cast Shadow Steel, dealing 1600 shadow damage, and then converts 100% of the damage he just dealt to you and heals himself with it. Whew. Okay, and with that, that is all of Malistaire the Undying's cheats. Now you guys can see why this was a nightmare back in the day, even with a full team of 4. Because if someone on your team didn't understand the cheats, he could just throw away the entire run for the team. Like, the whole team would suffer as a result 100%. But with that being said, let's see how Alexander Lionheart was able to conquer it. Now, because this is a long fight, I'm not going to go turn by turn, but rather a general overview as to how he was able to get through it. He starts to duel off by using Embrace, which will reduce the damage dealt to him by 20%. After this, he attempts to blade stack after this, and then actually goes for a Balefrost Bubble, which is a really good idea. Unfortunately, he mistimes a secondary interrupt cycle, and because of this, the blades get removed, so he sort of gets reset back to square one. He casts Empower, which is a really useful spell for soloing in general. What this spell does is that whenever an enemy hits you with a 4 pip damage spell or higher, you get a pip. And since you're in a 1v4 situation, the enemies will trigger this aura a lot. After this, he goes for a simple double blade and then goes for Snow Angel. He's able to do enough damage so that the minions are taken out first, making this fight a billion times more easy. From this point on, his strategy is to simply sustain himself and reset up for another big hit in order to knock Malistaire into a shadow form. Interestingly enough, Alexander Lionheart didn't go for the Doom and Gloom, but instead opted to just let Malistaire obtain all 48,000 of his health back. But nevertheless, the rest of the fight is relatively straightforward. He sustains himself with Satyr healing for 3,000 apiece, which is a big reason why the Malistaire fight is bad, but isn't that bad, because he has no healing cheat, which means he's able to heal during this fight with no issue. He waits for the Bone Dragon to do his other cheat, which plays the 100% universal trap on Malistaire, like I mentioned earlier, sets up for a very big hit. And just like that, Darkmoor is conquered solo. So, let's quickly rank the bosses in Darkmoor from easiest to hardest. The easiest is definitely Howling Chaney. He's honestly a breeze to get past. Second, I would have to go with Octane Wormcrawl. He's also a breeze to get through. His cheat isn't that crazy outside of his crazy pierce. At 6, surprisingly, I'd say Spirit of Darkmoor, and at 5th, I'd go with Sir Blackwater. The reason why I think Sir Blackwater is slightly harder is because Spirit of Darkmoor only has 14,000 HP, while Sir Blackwater is rocking 18,000. That 4,000 HP difference means another Blade of Trap you have to set up for Sir Blackwater. Also, if you pull the Darkmoor Squire mobs alongside him, it gets even more ridiculous. Fourth hardest I would say is Shane Von Shane 1. Third I would say is Shane Von Shane 2. Second hardest is surprisingly Malistaire, and the hardest fight without a doubt is definitely the Yevgenny fight. Malistaire definitely takes longer and has more cheats, but Yevgenny's cheats are, in my opinion, way more oppressive. Also, because him and his minions are ice, the shielding and stun potential is what makes this fight way more ridiculous than the Malistaire fight in my opinion. Now here's the real challenge. What would it take to solo Darkmoor at the level you unlock it at, level 100? 40 levels lower than what Alexander Lionheart did it at. It would take insanity. Literal insanity. If you notice throughout his run, Alexander had a lot of close calls. Even at 140, it was no joke. And trying to conquer this 40 levels lower would be ridiculous. At 140, you also have access to better spells, better gear, better stats, and overall just better everything. So let's figure this out. Now, in order for a level 100 to accomplish this, you would of course need to pick the right school. We're ruling out death for this challenge because it's by far the easiest. If I'm being honest, it isn't much of a challenge when you really think about it, because pretty much all of their good spells heal the player while hitting. These spells are called Drain. So let's say if I use a Scarecrow and do 2,000 damage to all 4 enemies, I heal back a whopping 4,000. Yeah, death in this game is pretty broken. Darkmoor solo runs on a death have been done before, and if I'm being honest, if you know what you're doing, it's not that tough. Out of the other 6 schools of the game, here are the schools that I think would have the easiest or hardest time soloing Darkmoor. The hardest, of course, being balance. You just wouldn't have a chance in my opinion. I think the hardest thing would be damage output, since it's much harder to blade and trap stack on a balance, since their damage spells are split into 2 different classes. You have normal balance spells that do balance damage, and then you have balance hits that do damage from other schools. Spectral Blast, for example, is the first one you get, and it has chance to either do Firestorm or Ice damage to the enemy. Hydra does all 3, and spells like Chimera do Death, Life, and Myth damage. The problem with this is that when playing balance, you usually want to maximize on balance damage, and you do that through gear, obviously. But then you won't even be able to make spells like Spectral Blast, Hydra, or Chimera work very well, since you will probably have no damage stats towards those schools at all. Running universal damage gear is an option, but good universal damage gear is hard to come by, and then most of the time you end up sacrificing other important stats anyway. Also, because blade and trap stacking on a balance is way harder to do. Balance blade only gives 25% more damage as opposed to the 35% that the other school blades give. Their main trap option is Hex, which is good, but considering there's multiple bosses in Darkmoor that have cheats that go against universal traps or universal blades, it's just too much of a hassle. It's just not worth it, and it's a hard school to make work in the situation. Myth is interesting because your damage output is actually solid, but because every boss is stun immune, you won't really have the opportunity to put the secondary effect of half your spells to full use. Fire is another interesting one, but your lack of HP would make it kind of difficult, but I do think Fire would maybe have a chance. Life honestly has a really good chance. Your main issue will just be finding the right balance between how you output your damage and when you need to heal. Now that I think about it, Life might actually be the best option since he boosts off of Malistaire in both Shane fights, meaning he'll do an additional 20% more damage on Shane and 40% more damage on Malistaire. The only boss you would need to use Prism on is the very first one, Howling Chaney, which is the easiest. Ice is also one of the better schools for the job in my opinion, simply because Ice is the best school at stacking resistant HP. Ice will do more damage output on Malistaire since he has incoming boost towards Ice damage as well. However, you will need to Prism for the Yevgenny fight, the toughest fight in Darkmoor, and having to take a turn using a Prism could mean losing a run if things go south on that turn. But here's the thing, it's like what makes Darkmoor so tough is how much pierce these bosses have. Because of this, their damage output is just that scary. As a matter of fact, here's a clip of me getting one shot during the second Shane Von Shane fight. Okay, what is this? Is this Wild Bolt? Wait, why is it about to do some damage? Your best bet to counteract this is to maximize on how much your heals do. Because even if you do heal consistently and try to play more defensively, if the enemies are consistently doing 1,000 damage per round or every 2 rounds and you only heal for say 1300 with a satyr, plus some healing incoming. You won't get any more. The best way to do this is to of course stack as many healing incoming jewels as possible, which albeit are pretty hard to come by, and or use one of the most important spells in the game for soloing Darkmoor, Sanctuary. Sanctuary is a global spell that when played, the treasure card version will make all healing spells heal for 60% more than normal. As we'll see a little bit later, this spell is a cheat code for Darkmoor. Now, what spawned the idea for this video was watching Alexander's Darkmoor solo since it popped in my recommended a while back, but after watching it, I immediately checked to see if anyone had soloed it at level 100. A lot of the results are death solos naturally. For example, fellow WizTuber Ferric, he also did it at one point, which like I said, it still is impressive, but it's death, so we're discounting it. Another one that caught my attention was Player N, who soloed all 3 levels of Darkmoor on a fire, but he did it at level 105, which was still impressive, but it's not 100. However, a successful Darkmoor solo at level 100 had been hiding in plain sight for a long time, and you won't believe what school was used to do it. The player in question is Kane Soulbreaker, a YouTube channel with only 482 subscribers. Nevertheless, he has footage of him soloing all 3 parts of Darkmoor at level 100 on a storm. No elixirs, no funny shit, straight up. Let's see how he did it. First and foremost, he's only running with 3,841 HP. Gear-wise, he's going into Darkmoor Part 1 running the Malistaire hat, robe, and boots. He's running the Misty Mountain Mandolin wand, which is a really interesting choice because instead of using a wand that gives damage or crit, he opts for crit block and healing incoming. He's running with the Cosmic Chris of Fame, an Exalted Life Amulet, and the Stellar Signet Ring. It seems that his strategy is to maximize on as much healing incoming as humanly possible. Also, this solo came out before Archmastery was a thing, which explains the Life Mastery Amulet. His strategy for Howling Chaining is pretty interesting. He starts off by fortifying on turn 1 and life shielding on turn 2. Then turn 3 he goes for Sanctuary, opting to play a lot more defensively than in Alexander's run. He double blades after that, but if you notice he's starting to run low on HP, so he goes for a Regenerate, which will consistently heal him over the course of 3 rounds. Notice how much he's healing for though. Prioritizing the healing income is honestly a pretty smart strategy that I really wish I thought of. After this, he gets put in a really weird spot because Howling Chaining goes for Gnomes, which after hitting places 2 Life Dispels on Kane. Luckily though, Regenerate plus the Sanctuary and the amount of healing incoming he has is more than enough to sustain him long enough to go for a Stormlord, which is enough to kill 2 of the 3 minions. He then does something I didn't expect. The next 2 turns, he actually casts 2 of his heals in order to get rid of the Life Dispels. At first, I thought he was going to just keep them there and YOLO the rest of the fight without healing. That play actually kind of blew my mind, but I'm not mad about it. After this, he single blades again and goes for a Stormlord, killing the last minion. And now at this point, it's a matter of sustaining yourself long enough in order to set up the killing blow on Howling Chaining, which his win condition, surprisingly, is Storm Owl. Something I did not expect. After blade stacking, he attempts to go for game, but is shy by just 1,000 damage. He blades the following turn and finishes off the fight with a Tempest. And just like that, the first fight of Darkmoor is complete. His Sir Blackwater fight was also a much different strategy than Alexander Lionheart's. He decides to kill the minions first once again, then hard play defensively long enough to set up one big hit with Storm Owl. Now, if you guys remember, Sir Blackwater's cheat cycles are pretty unforgiving, so the best strategy against him in a solo setting is definitely to one-shot, because if you don't, once Sir Blackwater gets into his life interrupt cycle, he spams Rebirth, and then once he gets into a storm cycle, he'll start spamming Healing Current, which is really annoying, because eventually, if you don't kill him, he'll just get back to full. I'm not going to break down every turn, because this was a very long fight, but a few things I am going to note. Kane also utilizes a spell known as Supercharge, which is interesting since you can't blade yourself in this fight, because Sir Blackwater immediately will cast Disarm to remove it. What Kane does to bypass this cheat is really smart, though. He utilizes Dissipate, which is the Storm D-spell, right before going for the Supercharge. This cancels out Sir Blackwater's cheat and allows him to keep the Supercharge on himself. Now, Supercharge is a spell that you really won't use that often, but in the right situation, it is pretty damn strong. If you cast a Supercharge with max pips, that's a plus 140% Stormblade. For comparison, that's the same as stacking 2 Feints on top of each other. After Blade and Trap stacking some more, he goes for a Shadow Strike on his second to last turn, and now he's fully set up to go for game, doing 28,000 damage. Pretty clean Sir Blackwater fight, and I honestly, that Dissipate play was pretty damn smart. Moving on to Darkmoor Part 2, Octane Wormcrawl is pretty straightforward. One thing you will obviously notice though is that because Kane is a Storm and is running with way less HP, he still has to play pretty defensively, even though this fight is a little bit easier than the rest of them, simply because they can still output serious damage. Either way, Kane is able to get rid of the minions. He then is able to rack up pips and go for game with a fully pipped Tempest. Moving on to boss number 4, and Spirit of Darkmoor, surprisingly, is pretty easy for Kane. At least from what it seems. I don't know how many takes this took. He starts to do a lot by using Windstorm to get traps on all the enemies. Then on turn 2, he goes for Empowerment, which is going to be really good for the situation. If you guys remember, essentially whenever an enemy hits you with a 4 pip spell or higher, you gain a pip because of Empowerment. You can even trigger this effect yourself if you heal yourself with any healing spell that costs 4 pips or higher. Turn 3, he goes for a Potent Windstorm in order to have 2 stack now. After this, his health gets dangerously low, so he immediately goes for a Satyr heal. Turn 4, he goes for the Feint on the boss. He spends the next few turns healing himself back up to full. Once done, he goes for a Galvanic Field, which is smart because using a Feint or a Blade will result in him taking damage. He then goes for Storm Owl, which is just enough to kill the boss. With the boss dead now, all he has to do is focus on the minions. Because the minions are myth and are already double trap stacked, all he has to do is sustain himself long enough to either go for a Tempest, Stormlord, or a Sirens. He also utilizes Stun Block here, which is a very smart tactic to make sure he doesn't get screwed over by Medusa or a Basilisk. A few turns later, he has enough pips to go for game with Sirens, and with that, Spirit of Darkmoor is conquered. Okay. Shenmon Shang 1 is next. The fight begins, and on turn 1, Kane goes for a really interesting play, Death Bat. A spell that costs 1 pip and does damage over time for 3 rounds. Now, this is crucial to this fight. Reason being is that if you look back at Shenmon Shang's cheats, it says that if he's damaged at any point during his interrupt cycle, it will reset. Meaning that casting a damage overtime spell will give you 2 turns of breathing room to either blade up or set up some defense. I do want to note though that if instead of damage it said attacked, this fight will be a billion times harder. So on turn 1 he goes for Death Bat, then on turn 2 he goes for Fortify. On turn 3 he blades. And on turn 4 he goes for Tempest and times it perfectly to where not only does he do enough damage to get rid of the minions, but hitting here also keeps the Shane cheat from triggering. On turn 5, he goes for another Death Bats, once again giving him 2 more turns of breathing room. Then the next 2 turns, he blade stacks. On turn 8, he goes for another Death Bats. Then on turn 9, he casts a Fortify. And on turn 10, he actually opts to heal here. Now, because of the Fortify and his resist, he actually manages to cut down the heal cheat so that it only does 584 damage. Since he heals for 2,000, that is more than enough of a worth a trade-off. From here, the strategy is very straightforward. He death bats into either a blade or sustaining himself, depending on the situation. And finally, with 4 blades and a galvanic, goes for game with Storm Owl once again. Darkmoor Part 1 and 2 solo on a storm was now possible. It was now time for Kane to conquer the graveyard, but this was going to be different. What Kane didn't know is that he would embark on a challenge that would inevitably take him 5 months to accomplish, because the RNG required to conquer the graveyard is unbelievable. It was now time for him to go up against the hardest boss in Darkmoor, period, Yevgenny. Let's see how he did it. Gear-wise, he made some changes for the fight, rocking the Hood of Desert Rains, a hat you can get from crafting in Chrysalis, the Malistaire robe of course, and the ancient Persian Gavase from the Ghost Horde pack. He's rocking the Photon Axe from the Celestial Spellament pack, the Dragon's Talon of Talent which drops from Yevgenny himself, the Exalted Life Amulet which you can reliably get from Cronus and Tartarus, and surprisingly the Hopper Ring of Spine Chills. Now this ring is actually really clever for this fight. It gives 9 extra ice resist and 20 healing incoming, as well as 18% pip chance and even 22 crit block. Specifically for this Yevgenny fight, this ring is damn near flawless. Interestingly, he's also rocking a life crit jewel and a stun resist jewel. So let's get into the fight. On turn 1, he starts off by going for a potent feint on the boss. Turn 2, he goes for a potent storm trap, and on turn 3, he goes for a normal feint, which means now he has 3 traps stacked on the boss successfully. Also, keep in mind, luckily the minions haven't casted any stuns, because one thing you'll notice is the lack of conviction. Because he's opting to trap stack first, he isn't going to trigger Yevgeny's stun sheet at all. He just has to hope that nobody on their team goes for any spells that have stun on them. Because if at any point they cast Frost Giant or anything that stuns, the run is basically over. On turn 4, Kane immediately goes for a big play, using King Artorias, hoping to get an early kill before his cheat cycle happens on turn 5. He's able to do just enough damage to get the job done. However, he's down to 528 health with 2 damage overtimes on him, so he needs to frantically dig for a heal here. He luckily pulls Pixie, which heals him for 700, keeping him in the fight, and at this point it's a matter of spam healing and using Fortify in order to get into a comfortable position. Once Kane is in a position to where he can afford to take a little bit of damage, he uses this opportunity to blade stack a little bit and set up his big hit to go for game. Now, because the enemies are pretty stacked with tower shields and frozen armors, he needs to set up a lot in order to punch through all of them. Eventually, he's able to blade stack and go for game using glow bugs, dealing 27,000 damage to the minions. I cannot imagine what it must have felt like to finally get past his boss after 5 months of grinding for this. Seriously, just soloing up to here alone is an accomplishment. But with Yevgenny out the way, we can now move on to the next fight. Kane was now at the penultimate boss of Darkmoor, Shane Von Shane 2. Luckily, he is the easiest boss in the graveyard, but still definitely not a walk in the park. His main cheat is essentially the same as Shane Von Shane 1, and his other additional cheats surprisingly aren't that problematic, since while yes, he will cheat cast Supercharge, because he doesn't have Storm Mastery, he usually won't even utilize any of the Storm Blades that are on him. If anything, the biggest annoyance in this fight are the minions. Kane starts off with a really interesting strategy, however. He of course goes with Death Bats as we saw before in the first Shane fight, but then on turn 2, he goes for Myth Trap? At first I was confused, but then a keen eye would notice that if you look at Shane Von Shane 2's cheats, he has 50% resist on Storm and 20% incoming boost to Myth. Meaning that Kane is going for a strategy where at some point he's going to use a Prism and then use the Myth Traps to boost his damage even more. Another reason why this is really clever is because the Darkmoor Serfs tend to cast Leviathan a lot, a spell that after hitting takes away 2 of your blades. However, using traps while they have high pip and then maybe blading a little bit while they have low pip is a really clever way to avoid a potential Leviathan hit. Kane spends the first quarter of this fight stacking Myth Trap and of course using Death Bath to make sure Shane's cheat cycle doesn't trigger. One thing I did notice is that this Leviathan right here did 0 damage. Now Kane does change his gear going into the second fight of Graveyard, so I'm curious as to what his Storm Resist was going into the second fight because it had to be a lot. He does have a Fortify on him as well, so I assume it had to be in the high 70s or even low 80s. Later on in the fight, he decides to go for a Sanctuary into a Satyr, which does still trigger Shane's cheat, but his Satyr is now healing for 2,900, which of course is more than worth it. He then spends the back half of the fight healing, using Fortify and Trap Stack, using mainly Myth and Spirit Trap, which honestly is a really cool strategy. He then gets an opening to mash Storm Prism and Double Blade. Kane now has everything set up in place to finally go for a game with Glow Bugs, this time his damage being very much close to what the enemy's HP was, meaning he played this fight about as efficiently as seemingly possible. And with that, Shane Von Shane 2 was conquered, and soloing Darkmoor at level 100 on a Storm all the way up to Malistaire was now possible. It was now time for Malistaire the Undying, the final boss of Darkmoor. Let's see how Kane did it. The battle begins and Kane wastes no time immediately blade stacking his first 3 turns, then going for a Siren's turn 4, getting rid of the minions. This is done flawlessly since on turn 5 the cheat cycle begins, where every 4 rounds after this, all blades will be removed from the player. However, after successfully doing this, Malistaire's other cheat casts take place back to back, leaving Kane with only 43 HP. But then this happens. Yup, his pet Maycast healed just in time. I think that is probably the single greatest pet main cast to ever happen on this game, period. After this, he immediately goes for a heal, and because of his gear setup, is able to crit his satyr, healing for 3,000, which is insane. The next step for him is to start trap stacking. He's opting for a similar strategy he did against Shane Von Shane 2, which is stacking myth traps and then afterwards stacking storm traps because he's gonna go for a prison play at some point. Malistaire does in fact have 20% resist to storm and 20% incoming damage to myth, so it makes sense. After fully trap stacking successfully while sustaining himself with heals, he only opts for one storm blade, which is pretty funny. The bulk of his damage obviously coming from the traps. He then goes for Storm Owl, doing 58,000, knocking Malistaire into a shadow form. Now it was time for the second half of the fight. Kane immediately continues healing and trap stacking once again, also taking into account Malistaire's additional negative Bone Dragon cheat, which if you remember when triggered, it places a plus 100% universal damage trap on Malistaire himself, which makes fighting Malistaire in a shadow form just a little bit easier. You'll also notice that Kane didn't go for the Doom and Gloom strategy, but instead opted to just keep Sanctuary up, because if you remember, there is a strategy where if you use a TC Doom and Gloom before killing Malistaire the first time, he will only revive with 25k HP instead of 48,000. However, for Kane, it didn't matter at all. After successfully trap stacking while sustaining himself with heals, he casts a huge Storm Owl and goes for game. With enough traps placed, he's able to do 64,000 damage, defeating Malistaire the Undying, and completing the Darkmoor solo at level 100 on a storm. According to Kane, this challenge took roughly 400 hours and 5 months of grinding. And if you take into account when his Darkmoor Part 1 and 2 video were uploaded, it took Kane well over 2 years to conquer this beast of a challenge. Kane had officially soloed all of Darkmoor at level 100 on a storm. Just saying those words out loud feel really weird. Storm is a school that is known for being an absolute glass cannon, so the fact that he was able to maximize his healing and use specific gear for certain bosses was really clever. Darkmoor was a dungeon that was notoriously a problem for thousands upon thousands of players. To say this is impressive is an understatement, and a video on this had to be made. I actually had recently been attempting a Darkmoor solo on my TikTok stream and was able to solo all 3 parts on my ice at level 100 as well. While still impressive and I was definitely proud of this achievement, this is of course after the Archmastery system was added, meaning that the Life Mastery Amulet wasn't necessary, so I was able to focus on maximizing HP and resistance. But even that alone took me an entire month to do. Kane made history for sure, and whether or not he's in the community anymore, this accomplishment definitely did not go unnoticed. Now, before this video ends, there is one thing I want to put on the table. What would it take for a full Darkmoor solo completely deathless? Now, here's the thing. If Darkmoor can be soloed as we saw, then technically speaking, yes, Darkmoor can be soloed completely deathless. Now, the RNG that would require would be unfathomable. I don't even want to think about that right now. Maybe one day somebody will go for this ridiculous challenge, and maybe one day somebody might even achieve it, but probably not. It is fun to think about though. Whether soloing Darkmoor at level 100 is easier or harder than the Wiz Nuzlocke is up for debate, and I'm actually curious what you guys think. What is more difficult, the Wiz Nuzlocke or Darkmoor solo or Deathless solo? Let me know down in the comments. With that being said, thank you for watching. I hope this video was satisfying to watch, and I do hope you all enjoyed. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for watching. Once again, congratulations, Kane, for the awesome solo. Thank you to Alexander Lionheart as well for the inspiration for this video. And as always, I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.